Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my Week 5 quarterback and tight end rankings for the 2024 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, we're covering all topics regarding these two positions, beginning with matchups, talking about which defenses are allowing the most fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks and tight ends so that we can identify the most advantageous matchups going into the week. After which, I'll transition into talking about these players on an individual basis, sharing with you guys my thought process and opinions while also presenting statistics in order to justify these overall rankings. If you're looking for my thoughts on a specific player, there are timestamps down in the description. While you're down there, if you have not yet already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. We're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2024 season with the singular goal of trying to help you win a 2024 fantasy football championship. Later tonight, after the Thursday night game, I will be streaming here on the channel. So for those of you who are interested, be sure to swing on by. Also, at the end of today's video, after I've concluded talking about the quarterback and tight end positions, I'll be putting together a pick'em slip via Underdog. So again, at the end of today's episode, I'll put that together. For those of you interested, be sure to check out Underdog. Thank you very much. Okay, let's get into talking about matchups regarding the quarterback position. I've gone ahead and I've collected quarterback passing statistics allowed in terms of passing yards, passing touchdowns, and of course interceptions thus far this season from weeks 1 through 4. And we have found that the Jacksonville Jaguars are allowing the most fantasy points per game based on passing statistics. Now, of course, there are a lot of quarterbacks in the National Football League that find themselves a lot of success within the running game, but the matchup itself against the coverage doesn't really dictate whether or not, a guy like Derek Carr is going to have an increase in terms of overall rushing yardage when he doesn't run the ball at all. Therefore, we just want to isolate passing statistics and find that the Jaguars, Commanders, Panthers, Texans, Colts are the most advantageous matchups going into this upcoming week. Of course, 3 of those teams consisting of the AFC South. So, of course, anytime you have an opportunity of taking on those defenses, it's great. So we'll talk about these, overall advantageous matchups as we progress throughout today's episode. I also want to show you some of the more difficult matchups going into the given week. Of course, Chicago, Tennessee, Saints, Jets, etc. Do not forget that the Tennessee Titans, Los Angeles Chargers, Philadelphia Eagles, along with the Detroit Lions are all on bye week this week. So there won't be these matchups to be able to take advantage of or have to worry about going into the week. Either way, just wanted to go ahead and present these statistics. I will refer back to them, but let's go ahead and let's transition into talking about my top 16 quarterback rankings. But before I do, like I mentioned before, at the end of today's episode, I will be putting together a couple pick'em slips via Underdog. If you guys haven't checked them out already, if you sign up today using code Andrew and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10, not only are you going to be able to claim the first-time deposit offer, but you'll get my rankings sent to you every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the season, weeks 5 through 18. These rankings are by position, by tier, quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, kicker, defense, flex, half PPR, full PPR, all-encompassing rankings in order to help you capture victories and, of course, a 2024 fantasy football championship. So for those of you interested, check out the map to the right side of the screen to determine your eligibility based on your current location. And if in fact you are not eligible based on your location, or perhaps have used a code in the past, whether it's mine or somebody else's in a prior season, you can also check out the Patreon. All the rankings are available there. Thank you very much. Okay, let's begin with our number 1 at the quarterback position. It is Josh Allen. He's coming off a very underwhelming performance of 7.3 fantasy points. That is already twice this season that he has had less than 10 fantasy points. All of last year, only one performance of such existed. Now, the 7.3 fantasy points he put up last week against the Baltimore Ravens was quite literally the worst performance of Josh Allen's fantasy football career going back to his rookie year in 2018. So we're not often going to see very lackluster performances from him and this offense as a whole. This upcoming week, they take on the Houston Texans, quite literally the 4th best matchup at the position, allowing over 13 fantasy points per game just off of passing statistics isolated, not to mention the potential rushing upside that Josh Allen has every single week. Now, if Josh Allen wasn't already motivated enough based on his lack of production last week, they take on the Houston Texans that include, of course, Stephon Diggs. He's going to be trying to send a message that, hey, we don't need Stephon Diggs. We can go ahead and function as an offense and be a Super Bowl contender even without him. Again, we're expecting Josh Allen to bounce back, and of course, he's an automatic start every week. Our number 2, Lamar Jackson. Again, Lamar Jackson has played incredibly well in the last 2 weeks, but he has only had 33 passing attempts in the last 2 weeks combined. He's literally 25 of 33. Very seldom are they ever having to throw the ball because in the last 2 weeks, they are taking commanding leads, whether it is against the Dallas Cowboys or the Buffalo Bills, and they are just running out the clock. And even Lamar Jackson has found himself in abundance of overall success in the running game, back-to-back games of scoring a rushing touchdown, which only continues to elevate his overall potential of success. I mean, coming off of a week in which he scored 3 touchdowns, had 54 rushing yards, point-wise, that's nearly 5 touchdowns of overall production. So going into this upcoming week, taking on the Cincinnati Bengals, a division rival where he's very much so familiar with them. Last season in the 2 games in which he took on the Cincinnati Bengals, 230 plus passing yards in both those games, 2 plus passing touchdowns in each game, and 50 plus rushing yards. The expectation is that the Cincinnati Bengals are going to be in trouble as Lamar Jackson and Derrick Henry will be running all over their defense. Our number 3 to close out the S tier It is the current number 1 overall quarterback in fantasy football, Jayden Daniels, coming off another incredible week of 24 plus fantasy points. Again, as of this current moment in time, he's coming off of back-to-back games of an 80+% passing completion percentage. He's the first player ever in the NFL history to accomplish that. If this week he's able to have himself another week in which he's able to get 80+% passing completion percentage, he would be the first player in NFL history ever, not just a rookie, but ever, to be able to accomplish that 3 times in a single season, much less back-to-back games. Going into this upcoming week, they take on the Cleveland Browns. Again, I've talked about it all season. The Cleveland Browns defense is no longer elite. They can definitely be taken advantage of, and considering how incredibly well the Commanders' offense has been playing, Jayden Daniels is implied to have himself a monster game here against their defense. Moving on to our number 4, we have Jordan Love, who last week returned and obviously returned with a lot of fantasy production. He brought us many of gifts in regards to passing touchdowns, 4, along with 383 passing yards, all while not really playing a great game. Had a 59% passing completion percentage, but it doesn't matter. This upcoming week gets another week away from that injury, gets another week of practice, and is going to be ready to take on the Los Angeles Rams, quite literally the 9th best matchup at the position. Over the course of Jordan Love's career, just looking at the last 8 starts that he has had, each of them have consisted of 2 or more touchdowns minimum. The expectation is 2 touchdowns, if not even more upside, considering how terrible this Rams defense has been thus far this season. Moving on to our number 5, we have Justin Fields. The fact of the matter is, Justin Fields is playing the best football of his entire career, and it's not even remotely close. Now that he's unlocked the red zone rushing potential, that is only going to continue to elevate his overall game. Now, in the last couple weeks, we've really begun to see him get comfortable within this offense and with Arthur Smith's play calling. Based purely on his passing yardage alone, I mean, just a couple weeks ago, 245 passing yards. Just this last week, 312 passing yards. When Justin Fields is reaching those levels of overall upside, on top of the fact that he has the capabilities, just like he did last week against the Colts, of having 10 rushing attempts for 55 rushing yards and 2 rushing touchdowns. When you have those capabilities, you are extremely valuable in fantasy football. We talk about rushing quarterbacks being at the top of the conversation every single year, and Justin Fields is going to continue that conversation in 2024. They take on the Dallas Cowboys this week. The Cowboys allowed Daniel Jones to throw the ball all over the yard last week. He had 281 passing yards and only had a turnover at the final play of the game in terms of like a Hail Mary. So ultimately, if Daniel Jones is going to succeed in that kind of fashion, why not Justin Fields coming off an incredible performance? Number 6, we have Baker Mayfield. Look, Baker Mayfield has played incredibly well himself, coming off a week in which he scored 3 total touchdowns. Now has an opportunity of taking on the Atlanta Falcons, a defense that quite literally is allowing a 72.45% passing completion percentage to opposing quarterbacks thus far this season. Now, even though Derek Carr wasn't able to take advantage of this matchup against the Atlanta Falcons in week 4, I mean, the Saints offense did score on a consistent basis. We saw Taysom Hill score. We saw Alvin Kamara score. So touchdowns were able to be scored. It's just a matter of how are the Tampa Bay Buccaneers going to be able to score their touchdowns. And it's always going to go through Baker Mayfield and be able to elevate the potentials of guys like Mike Evans and, of course, Chris Godwin. Now, even though they don't have Jalen McMillan and Trey Palmer in today's game, of course, they do have Sterling Shepard. They still have Cade Otton, who has seen himself in abundance of overall targets. And we'll talk about him in the tight end section. But Baker Mayfield is an automatic play in my mind going into the week. Number 7, we have Brock Purdy. Look, Brock Purdy takes on a very advantageous matchup against the Arizona Cardinals, who just allowed a bunch of points from the Washington Commanders. But not only that, thus far this season, the Arizona Cardinals are allowing a 81.58% passing completion percentage to opposing quarterbacks. That is right. All the quarterbacks that they have faced have torched them. And that's saying a lot, especially considering Matthew Stafford in week 2 did absolutely nothing. So when we take all this into account, the fact that the San Francisco 49ers last season, in the 2 games in which they took on the Arizona Cardinals, they combined for 80 total points in those 2 games. The 49ers are implicated for a lot of scoring within the given week. I'm expecting Brock Purdy to be an automatic start, even in the absence of not having, the dump off, production that Christian McCaffrey was able to present over the course of all of last season. That's not really elevating Brock Purdy because, again, Jordan Mason isn't a receiving back. Considering all of that, Brock Purdy still has himself a lot of upside now with a healthy Kittle, Deebo Samuel, and Ayuk hopefully finding himself in the right positions this upcoming week. Moving on to our number 8, we have CJ Stroud. He takes on the Buffalo Bills. It is not an easy matchup, but for the second consecutive day now, Joe Mixon is not practicing. So if in fact this offense is going to have no running game once again, it's going to lead, to, of course, a lot of passing attempts from CJ Stroud in order to keep up with the Buffalo Bills offense. Again, if CJ Stroud is implicated for 250 yards and 2 passing touchdowns at a base minimum in order to compete with the Buffalo Bills, much less try to win this game, again, we're going to anticipate that he's going to throw the ball 40 plus times. If that's going to take place, he definitely has the capabilities with a Tank Dell returning to this lineup to be able to air it out and light up a defense of this caliber. Again, The Buffalo Bills secondary have played incredibly well, but CJ Stroud is up for the task on hand, coming off a pretty solid week of over 340 passing yards and 2 touchdowns. Our number 9 is Joe Burrow. My primary concern for Joe Burrow revolves around the fact that the Baltimore Ravens, really, their biggest strengths are pass rush and secondary. And the reason why they get to utilize those strengths so often is because once they take commanding leads, just in the same way in which they did against the Cowboys and Bills in the last 2 weeks, and they're up 2 scores or 3 scores, it forces the opposing team to have to throw quite literally every single down. And if Joe Burrow is going to be in a situation where he's being chased down and not able to at least extend the ball down the field because the secondary is playing incredibly well for the Baltimore Ravens, just in the same way in which, of course, Josh Allen struggled last week, it could be very tricky. But Joe Burrow, very familiar with this overall matchup, taking him on twice this season. Again, this is quite literally the 10th best matchup at the position. The Baltimore Ravens have allowed a lot of passing statistics to opposing quarterbacks, so we're hoping Joe Burrow is up for the task on hand, even against a tough secondary in the Baltimore Ravens. Number 10, we have Geno Smith. Considering the Giants may be without both Malik Nabers and Devin Singletary, their offense is going to be, deemed ineffective against the Seattle Seahawks defense. The Giants defense themselves against opposing quarterbacks are the 7th best matchup. We would assume that Geno Smith should find himself in abundance of overall success. This may in fact be a one-sided affair, which does not help the overall upside of Geno if in fact they take a commanding lead early enough to where they're just running out the clock in the second half and not allowing him to get to a 2-3 potential touchdown game within the overall week. Number 11, we have Trevor Lawrence taking on the Indianapolis Colts. This is quite literally the best matchup that Trevor Lawrence could possibly ask for going into week 5, as their current record is 0-4. This is the 5th best matchup. Last season against the Colts, they beat them both times. The Jacksonville Jaguars offense scored 30-plus points in both of those games, and the expectation is that this could be a bounce-back week for Trevor Lawrence and the Jaguars offense. They certainly need a bounce-back performance or a wake-up performance considering how the season has gone thus far. But Trevor Lawrence, again, coming off a solid week of 2 touchdowns, we would like to see more rushing upside. We would also like to see him be far more efficient within his overall passing game. But I think going against the Indianapolis Colts, whose defense really cannot stop a soul thus far this season against any team that they have played, the expectation is success for Trevor Lawrence. Number 12 is Kyler Murray. Look, Kyler Murray, his performance in terms of the passing game wasn't all that bad. Still had a 73% passing completion percentage, but when he's not pushing the ball down the field to the targets like, Michael Wilson Jr., to Marvin Harrison Jr., against the Washington Commanders secondary of all defenses, it does give me a lot of concern. Now he has to take on the San Francisco 49ers, who again, throughout his career, has had himself a couple games here and there in which he's found himself victorious, but oftentimes it doesn't go well for Kyler. Luckily, he does get Trey McBride back, who is essentially his number 1 overall target and security blanket. But looking at last week's overall game, only having 1 rushing attempt for 3 rushing yards is not going to cut it for fantasy purposes. We have to hope that he starts scrambling far more often going forward. Moving on to number 13, Sam Darnold. Look, the fact of the matter is it is a London game. London games are typically weird. The outcomes are far different than if it was to be in Minnesota or to be in New York. But either way, they take on the Jets. It is a difficult matchup based on how that secondary has played. Of course, they've got one of the best defenses in the league. But the fact of the matter is, Sam Darnold is coming off of back-to-back games of 3 or more passing touchdowns and has a revenge game in order to send a message to his former team, the New York Jets. I'm all in on the revenge game status of him. I'm firing him up this week, even in London. Moving on to 14, we have Dak Prescott. He takes on the Pittsburgh Steelers. Not an easy matchup at all, especially considering his offensive line thus far this season hasn't been great with 2 rookies. And if you're going to try to stop, the presence of TJ Watt, it's going to be extremely difficult to do so. So hopefully they're able to at least chip block, or at very least just try to keep TJ Watt at bay and don't let him take over this game. But either way, just looking at last week's game, Joe Flacco came into that game very poised, very collected, and just diced up that defense very slowly. If you can keep Dak Prescott protected, he is very much so capable of dicing up defenses, coming off of a week in which he had an 82% passing completion percentage, 22 of 27 against the Giants defense. Again, if you keep him protected, he will be able to deliver for fantasy purposes. But again, TJ Watt's coming after him every single snap. It's going to be tough. Moving on to our number 15, we have Patrick Mahomes. I think this is quite literally the lowest I've ever had Patrick Mahomes ranked in my entire fantasy football YouTube channel. I don't think I've ever had him lower ranked, to be honest. And to be honest, he's just not a serviceable enough quarterback, especially with all the injuries that have taken place to this offense with Hollywood Brown, Rashee Rice, Isaiah Pacheco. This offense still managed to get 245 passing yards last week and a passing touchdown. We're able to score 17 points as an offense, but ultimately that is not going to cut it. If that is going to be the weekly production of Patrick Mahomes going forward, he would need to light up the scoreboards in order for us to feel far more confident in his overall potential. The final 2 quarterbacks I wanted to mention are both Anthony Richardson and Joe Flacco. Depending on who is going to play, I would rank it as such. If Anthony Richardson is healthy, He's going to be my number 5 quarterback ahead of Justin Fields. Again, he takes on the Jaguars. It is the best matchup at the position. Anthony Richardson, prior to his injury, had 71 passing yards, 3 of 4 passing, was lighting it up, also had himself rushing yards, needs to keep himself protected. But if in fact he is healthy and starting this week, of course, I'm firing him up against the Jacksonville Jaguars. Now, as for Joe Flacco, in the same vein, if in fact he is going to be the starting quarterback, I would start him ahead of Sam Darnold this week as a pick up and play option against the best matchup at the quarterback position. When we look at the last 6 regular season games, including week 4's overall performance from Joe Flacco, in the last 6 regular season games that he has participated in, he has been able to get himself 2 or more passing touchdowns in each of them. Again, a solid overall start, assuming, of course, Anthony Richardson is out. We'll keep that monitored. Okay, let's move on. Let's talk about the tight end position in regards to week 5. As you guys can see in regards to matchups, the Kansas City Chiefs, Baltimore Ravens, Colts, Vikings, Chargers are the best matchups at the position by a significant margin. Of course, we're going to try to fire up our tight ends against these defenses, but in a lot of these overall situations, there aren't great overall options. For example, Mike Gesicki coming off of a week in which he had 1 reception for -9 yards against the Baltimore Ravens. Are we excited about that? Not really. The Chiefs defense have allowed themselves the most fantasy points per game, but Juwan Johnson, is that someone that we're excited about playing? Maybe in a desperate situation, sure. But then we have Evan Engram against the Colts, Conklin against the Vikings. Those are advantageous matchups. We'll look into potentially talking about that furthermore as we progress throughout today's episode. Just wanted to go ahead and present these to you guys. Additionally, wanted to go ahead and present some of the more disadvantageous matchups. For example, the Commanders, the Texans, the Jets, the Cowboys, etc. Just presenting the statistics in regards to tight end receiving stats allowed thus far this season in a half PPR, receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns. Now that we covered that, again, do not forget, if you guys are trying to take advantage of the new customer special via Underdog today, by signing up using code Andrew and making a first-time deposit minimum of $10, you can take advantage of 0.5 total yards from Kirk Cousins. Again, at the end of today's episode, I'll be putting together a pick'em slip, so if you want to go ahead and throw that within it, be sure to do so. Thank you. Okay, let's go ahead and let's talk about the tight end position in regards to week 5. We begin with Travis Kelce, our number 1. He is back in this conversation of being the S-tier Kelce, and I hate that the reason why he is back in the S-tier is because that Rashee Rice got his knee completely taken out from under him by Patrick Mahomes, but it is the fact of the matter. Going forward, in the absence of Rashee Rice, Travis Kelce is going to be the relevant tight end and the top-tier tight end that he used to be. And he's going to be able to dominate in every single matchup because, again, he is functioning within the slot position majority of the time. And now that Rashee Rice is no longer active and in that position, taking away and siphoning that value, Travis Kelce should see himself double-digit targets and abundance of overall success within the upcoming games. Moving on to our number 2, coming off of the concussion protocol, we have Trey McBride. Again, this is under the assumption that he clears the protocol. He obviously didn't play last week because of that. But taking on the San Francisco 49ers, of course, Kyler Murray looked like he desperately needed Trey McBride out there in the offense last week. Again, even though it's not an easy matchup overall, week 15 against the San Francisco 49ers, 11 targets, 10 receptions, 102 receiving yards with Kyler Murray at quarterback. We're going to hope that the offense continues to go back in that direction and light up the field with Trey McBride's overall, efforts. Moving on to our number 3. Speaking of the San Francisco 49ers matchup, we have George Kittle. George Kittle, over the course thus far this season, when healthy, has been relevant. And most recently in back-to-back weeks, scoring receiving touchdowns in which he has played. So now that you take on the Arizona Cardinals, the defense that cannot stop a soul, just got completely destroyed by the Washington Commanders last week. I'm assuming that the Arizona Cardinals defense will play, slightly better, but ultimately it's not going to matter. The San Francisco 49ers last season in the 2 games against the Arizona Cardinals combined for 80 total points. And when we take into account that Brandon Ayuk hasn't played well thus far this season, it just opens up more and more opportunity for George Kittle to have himself a successful performance as our starting tight end. Moving on to our number 4, we have Jake Ferguson. In the last 2 games, since coming back from his injury, 18 total targets, which is a ridiculous amount of overall opportunity, especially when we have, tight ends like Mark Andrews getting himself 1 target a game. Ridiculous. Either way, Jake Ferguson, 18 targets, 13 receptions, 144 receiving yards in the last 2 games. With Brandon Cooks being out for the next couple weeks due to that knee infection, the expectation is that Jake Ferguson is going to continue to be the number 2 receiving target and the number 2 red zone target within this offense. Could have very easily had himself a receiving touchdown last week to put a bow on the top of his overall performance. Wasn't able to accomplish it, but nonetheless, going into this week, we do anticipate a lot of passing from the Dallas Cowboys in a negative game script, which is only going to help elevate Jake Ferguson's overall fantasy potential. Our number 5 is Brock Bowers. With the fact that, of course, Devontae Adams is probably never going to play another snap for the Las Vegas Raiders, it is only going to elevate the potential of Brock Bowers. Now, I understand in the last 2 weeks, he has been quiet in terms of his overall production, but in the last 2 weeks, the Denver Broncos haven't been quiet in their overall production in terms of allowing overall statistics to opposing tight ends. In the last 2 games, The Denver Broncos have allowed 14 receptions to opposing tight ends. We're anticipating a lot of hopeful upside for Brock Bowers, considering the number one receiver of the Raiders offense wants to be traded to the Jets, and the other number one receiver is going to be covered by Patrick Surtain. So, Brock Bowers should have himself a lot of opportunity for success within the upcoming week. Moving on to our number 6, we have Dalton Kincaid. I mentioned it moments ago, the Houston Texans matchup is not an easy one. Even going back to last season, the Houston Texans played incredibly well against opposing tight ends. But the fact of the matter is, at this current moment in time, Josh Allen has to send a message. He has to send a message that, with all the weapons that they currently have, they don't need Stephon Diggs. And with Khalil Shakir dealing with an ankle injury, and Dalton Kincaid slowly but surely every single week getting himself more and more targets, we are going to get ourselves back on track to Dalton Kincaid being a top-tier tight end option within fantasy football. Again, amongst all the receiving options of this offense, he's number 2 in terms of total targets, and going forward is going to potentially take over the number 1 spot in that conversation. Number 7, we have David Njoku. Again, this is very much so speculatory as to whether or not he returns this week. I know that he returned to practice on Wednesday. As for his Thursday status, we are not 100% certain. But again, if you go back to week 1, in the 2.5 quarters that he played with Deshaun Watson, he had 5 targets, 4 receptions, 44 receiving yards. And amongst all tight ends thus far this season, he's number 2 in terms of yards per route run. The volume of opportunity that he was given and the re-implementation of him within this offense could very easily lead to overall success. If in fact David Njoku is active this week, I'm firing him up again. This Deshaun Watson-led offense has to throw the ball all day long against the Washington Commanders. Again, is an advantageous matchup first and foremost, but additionally, they're in a position in which they're going to be in a negative game script for the entirety of this game. Moving on to another injured tight end that could be coming back this week, it is Evan Engram. Again, he is currently day-to-day with the hamstring, but if in fact he does play, they take on the Colts, quite literally the 3rd best matchup at the position in the last 2 games. The Pittsburgh Steelers tight ends have combined for 7 receptions, 89 and a touchdown, while Chicago Bears tight ends combined for 10 receptions, 97 and a touchdown. All of that damage done by Cole Kmet. If Evan Engram is active within the upcoming week, I'm firing him up in a top 8 capacity. Moving on to our number 9, we have Tucker Kraft. The fact of the matter is, Tucker Kraft, going back to last season, was highly relevant within this offense. If you go back and look at weeks 12 through the NFL playoffs of the 2023 season, in those 9 games without Luke Musgrave within the lineup, 4.7 targets, 3.4 receptions, 37.3 receiving yards, 0.33 touchdowns per game, and 9.18 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format. Earlier this week, as in yesterday, Wednesday, we did not see Luke Musgrave practice. If in fact he's dealing with an injury and is going to miss, it is only going to continue to elevate the overall potential of success for Tucker Kraft, who is taking on the Los Angeles Rams, who are quite literally the 9th best matchup at the position, allowing 8.8 fantasy points per game, while Kraft is coming off of a week in which he had 9 targets within this offense. Obviously, they're not going to throw the ball 50 plus times this week, but there's certainly a lot of potential upside for Tucker Kraft to take advantage of the matchup. Number 10, we have Cade Otton, who takes on the Atlanta Falcons later this afternoon. Again, with Trey Palmer and Jalen McMillan both out, it just presents more and more opportunity for Cade Otton to find success. In the last 2 games, Cade Otton, 17 targets, 13 receptions, 99 receiving yards. He's played 93% of the offensive snaps thus far this season for this offense. He's literally not coming off of the field. And just imagine if he's able to get himself implicated for a red zone or end zone target in which he's able to score. That's only going to continue to elevate his overall potential, considering how much of an incredibly high volume of targets he has had over the course of the last 2 weeks in comparison to weeks 1 and 2, in which he was barely or rarely utilized within this offense outside of just being a decoy within the scheme. Moving on to our number 11, we have Tyler Conklin. Look, Tyler Conklin, very similar to Cade Otton, never leaves the field, plays 90+% of the offensive snaps, but the fact of the matter is he takes on the Minnesota Vikings. This is a revenge game of sorts, taking on his former team, and it is, in fact, the 4th best matchup, allowing nearly 11 fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends thus far this season. The Green Bay Packers tight ends, 9 catches, 66 and a touchdown. San Francisco 49ers tight ends combined for 9 catches, 102 and a touchdown against this Minnesota defense. And in the last 2 games, Tyler Conklin has had himself 14 total targets, so the opportunity is there to take advantage of the matchup in London. Moving on to our number 12, we have Pat Freiermuth. Look, slowly but surely, Pat Freiermuth is getting himself more and more implementation within this offense in the influence of Arthur Smith and how he utilized tight ends last season as the primary play caller and the head coach of the Atlanta Falcons. I mean, again, the Atlanta Falcons last season amongst all teams were number 3 in terms of total tight end targets. So as long as they continue to elevate the overall opportunity for Pat Freiermuth, considering how well Justin Fields has played, In my opinion, it's only going to continue to keep him fantasy relevant in a top 12 capacity. Therefore, we have him in this conversation, taking on the Dallas Cowboys defense. Moving on to our number 13, we have Cole Kmet. Again, he is very much so competing with all of the other threats within this offense. DJ Moore revenge game, Rome Odunze in the deep ball, Keenan Allen close to the line of scrimmage. We have DeAndre Swift last week coming off a performance of 7 targets, 7 receptions, 72 receiving yards. There is a lot of competition within this offense, but he takes on the 7th best matchup at the tight end position, which is allowing 9.9 fantasy points per game. If Cole Kmet can survive within the range of 4 to 6 targets per week and potentially get himself red zone utilization, that's all we could ask for. But outside of that, a solid number 13 option. Number 14, we have Colby Parkinson, who again continues to be relevant for fantasy purposes. Taking on the Packers, quite literally the 6th best matchup at the position. Most recently, Tennessee Titans tight ends against the Green Bay Packers. 8 catches, 67 in a touchdown. Minnesota Vikings tight ends, 4 catches, 25 in a touchdown. Colby Parkinson, under the assumption, of course, Matthew Stafford is looking in his direction more often than not. Similar to last week in which he had 7 total targets, if we're able to get himself the ample opportunity required, taking on the Packers should at very least make him a top 15 option at the tight end position. Speaking of number 15, let's talk about Kyle Pitts. If in fact you have Kyle Pitts and you have any of these other available options, please start somebody else. But going into today's game against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, coming off of a week in which he had 3 targets, 0 receptions, 0 yards, 0 fantasy points, it is going to be very difficult to trust Kyle Pitts, but I still have a feeling that there is a potential in which he could end up having himself a solid overall performance. Again, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers haven't really shown to be, a terrible matchup against tight ends, but Kyle Pitts has found himself success against this defense in the past. And I'm anticipating that they're not going to completely ignore Kyle Pitts every single week. I understand he has separation issues in terms of, within the first 2 steps of Kirk Cousins, he's immediately looking down the field, looking in the direction of Kyle Pitts, and he's not open. They're going to have to scheme him open because, again, he's far too talented, especially after the catch, to not continue to try to get him the ball on a consistent basis. Moving on to the final tight end option, it is Mike Gesicki. Mike Gesicki doesn't play enough for me to 100% trust him, but again, he takes on the 2nd best matchup at the position. The Ravens allowed Buffalo tight ends to have 6 receptions for 45, Dallas tight ends 7 for 100, Las Vegas 10 for 109, and Kansas City with 6 and 71. Baltimore's defense cannot stop opposing tight ends. The only issue is Eric All, the rookie, tight end in this offense, is getting himself like 4 receptions per game, which is continuing to siphon away from Mike Gesicki. Either way, Mike Gesicki is brought in on play specifically to get him the ball. He has a very high, target percentage thus far this season, excluding last week, which was a complete disaster in a game in which, of course, when you only have Jamar Chase getting 6 targets, we don't expect Mike Gesicki to get much utilization. This is going to be a negative game script, and we're hoping for Mike Gesicki to have himself a bounce-back performance. All right, that's going to cover it in regards to my tight end and quarterback rankings for Week 5 of the 2024 fantasy football season. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Again, the final thing I wanted to mention is the pick'em slip that I'm putting together for tonight's game between the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and, of course, the Atlanta Falcons. As of right now, these are the 3 plays. Drake London going higher than 8.5 receiving yards in the first quarter. Chris Godwin going higher than 9.5 receiving yards in the first quarter. And Derrick Henry, anytime touchdown. Again, Derrick Henry has scored a touchdown in 4 consecutive games. But what gives me so much confidence about the first quarter production of Chris Godwin and Drake London is the following. Thus far this season, both of these wide receivers have been able to surpass this number in 3 of their 4 games. Chris Godwin accumulating 41, 38, 16, and 7 yards in first quarters of games. Drake London, on the other hand, 13, 14, 25, and 8. We're in a situation in which we're, of course, firing up both these overall plays. You will have the overall play pretty much done by the end of the first quarter. If you don't want to include Derrick Henry, you don't have to. I went ahead and I put a 20% profit boost on top of this, $25 entry turning into $136. Again, check out Underdog Fantasy. Of course, pick them responsibly. And of course, if you haven't yet already, use code Andrew, make a first-time deposit, minimum of $10 to get my rankings sent to you every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the season. Hopefully this hits. I'll be back later tonight after the Thursday Night Football game to answer questions via the live stream. For those of you interested, be sure to swing on by. But until then, thank you everybody for watching. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.